Welcome to our B-side for the week. This is our off-the-cuff podcast edition, where we talk about something that was inspired by the episode of that week, which was Tunnels and Trolls.
This is our graft on to the Tunnels and Trolls episode, where we just sort of let the ideas flow.
Yeah, this is much more free form. So, and we've had one of these before. Though we didn't label it as such. It was kind of an amusing byproduct, and we figured we'd keep it. But this week, we are getting into the idea of what a dungeon survival game is, which is something of a gaming philosophical topic. Troy, what are your thoughts on dungeon survival?
What I like about dungeon survival is the managing of your actual physical inventory, your kind of like your resources, right? And having to actually track it, know what you have, and make plans on what you have.
I agree. Actually, before we get too far into it, maybe we should define what dungeon survival actually is.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So dungeon survival, as I understand it, is epitomized in games like Dungeons & Dragons and Tunnels and Trolls, which is a game where you play one or multiple of a party of heroes exploring a kind of magical, mythic underworld expressed in these corridored graph paper dungeons. There are a lot of variations on this, but they do have some core elements. And I think, Troy, you even kind of made an interesting observation that they're almost a kind of horror game, but in a more of a economic sense.
Yeah, they have those survival horror hallmarks of resource management. And in a lot of the dungeon survival games, there's a sense that the dungeon can eat you alive. So there is a bit of a tension that it plays with that's more familiar in a horror game than just a strictly heroic fantasy game where the challenge is appropriate to your power level. In a dungeon survival game, that's not always true.
Yeah, I mean, if you discount like mechanics like dungeon level, which kind of, but not really, because, you know, there are fun little quirks in some games where, you know, you might fall through, there might be a trap where you fall through a hole in the floor and you take damage from the fall, and now you're also in a harder level of the dungeon.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, which is hilarious.
Gotta love when the dungeon spites you so hard.
So to jump back to your earlier point, yeah, the thing that makes dungeon survival a unique experience and something that can certainly create interesting and memorable stories, but has this sort of ruthless reality about it, is the bookkeeping. And it requires a certain diligence on the players, and I guess a kind of like mindset as well.
Yeah.
This might be just sort of like an affectation of modern gameplay, but people go in and it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a hero and I'm going to, you know, be the adventurer. And dungeon survival games kind of look at that and go, yeah, maybe.
100%. Like that's been some of my favorite experiences with the dungeon survival style of game is I'm not preordained to be the chosen one. I might end up being the chosen one if my wits and my luck are good enough, but it's not a given. And I have to use tools and manage my resources to get through to a conclusion where I might get to be a hero.
Yeah. Or otherwise you're dead.
Otherwise you get wasted.
You really have to, this is an important aspect, and those that get it love it, and those that don't play it, and as it should be. You're gonna have to accept, and even better, enjoy the fact that you could die. And sometimes in very petty ways. It's one of those things that if you're playing it authentically, and I say this, and that's total editorializing, there is no authentic way to play anything.
Right.
But if you catch my meaning, if you stick to the spirit of the thing, there's no pulling punches, there's no fudging dice. Older systems don't have this directly, but systems where the outcome is quite clear and the dice are rolled openly. There's a couple reasons why that's a good thing. One, no one's blaming the GM if someone gets killed,
Right.
which is nice. Everyone screams at the dice and not in your face.
Yep.
It really adds to the atmosphere of, yeah, that next trap could just take my head off. I'm not. There are extremes of this. There's the save or die mentality, and I think that sometimes can be a step too far.
Yes, I agree with that.
I think when I'm running a game and something like that or something extremely deadly comes up, I do my best to try to telegraph some hint of what might be around the next corner. So, like, you find a hallway and there are corpses, like the remains of rotting skeletons around here in this one section. And you're like, what did that?
Yes, like you're telegraphing through environmental cues to your players, there is danger here. And if the players are blind and don't pick that or pick up on that, it's kind of like their fault.
It's a game of hints in an odd way.
Yeah. No, I get that.
If at least that's how I like to do it. And I think that's fun because there's a death without suspense is callous. But that's the only affording that I go with. I love dungeon survival games. I'm somebody that I wouldn't say regularly plays NetHack, but I'll crack it out like every now and again and see how many times I can fail before I get tired of it.
Yeah.
And I do like roguelike games. And roguelike games are basically the CRPG equivalent of a dungeon survival game, which sometimes is called a dungeon crawler.
Something we were talking about a little earlier off mic was how you can have storyteller games, which are just games that facilitate telling stories. But you can also have these games that produce environments and events that themselves are worthy of recounting as stories, I mean to say, but they still exist as a game that isn't just solely to produce story outcomes. And I feel like a dungeon survival game is one of those sweet spots where it's mechanically satisfying. You have actual levers and knobs to interact with as a player in terms of your character and managing their inventory and their health and their MP and things like that. And then you are having these events happen that can be worthy of stories themselves. Like if you manage to narrowly avoid a trap, if you manage to defeat the Goblin Enclave, like all these different things can be great stories, but they still come through this gameplay experience that's really interesting to actually play if you want to deal with some of the, I don't know, I don't want to call it bookkeeping, but it kind of is.
It is. In order to play this type of game, you at least have to accept the bookkeeping. Better yet, you enjoy it as part of the simulation.
Right, yes.
I know there's this want, and I certainly have felt this in some games where I just want to push ahead. I just want to keep going. I don't want to have to keep like going and back bookkeeping to the sheets. But I find if you put yourself in the right mindset and say, this is a game we might clear 3 rooms tonight, maybe. And it's a much more pensive and thoughtful game in a weird way. But you have to be into that kind of play. That's essentially a prerequisite for play. I don't know that, because I think at one point this was sort of thought as to be, this is what the game is.
Yeah.
And so, we're playing D&D tonight. And, if you're in that first edition framework, I mean, even as far as like 3rd edition or 4th for that matter, and parts of 5th, but D&D has, at least in its earliest onset, that was the game. There are different takes on it, but most of what the rules consisted of was clearing rooms, getting loot. I mean, the fact that experience is based on gold count in early editions is essentially an incentive to pull gold out of the dungeon. I mean, you do get a little experience for monsters and maybe some other stuff if the GM wants, but it's about the loot. It's a different thing. And if you're, just to go back to my point, if you're going to do this now, you should very clearly state, like, this is the kind of game this is. So, like, if you're expecting to, like, mad swashbuckling and negotiating between great nations and all that. I'm like, this is not the game. This is not Lord of the Rings. This is Conan.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean. Like you're stealing a gem from a temple.
Yeah.
You're not the chosen ring bearer, for example.
This is not Two Towers, but Tower of the Elephant.
Okay.
To make a weird reference on either side of that. And again, Tolkien he's not my favorite. I'm more of a Robert Howard kind of guy. I'm more of that sort of weird fantasy, weird fiction.
Yeah.
Sword and sorcery element. But I do have a deep appreciation for Tolkien and that kind of world building. But that is a journey set by destiny, as opposed to one set by enlightened self-interest. As you and I had conversations in the past, sword and sorcery is effectively a Western with swords and magic.
Yeah, 100%. There's a frontiersmanship to it. There's a certain like cavalier carve out your own destiny.
Yeah, it's very much an American genre.
Yeah, I get that.
As opposed to Lord of the Rings, which is more rooted in European sort of assumptions about society and
like class and society and how they interact and your responsibility to the different classes that are within that make up your society, make up that fabric. It's interesting to think about the differences in fantasy, and then when you're playing a fantasy role-playing game, if you're trying to evoke these different fantasies, if you want to play a Conan style game, dungeon survival is what you need. Like, I kind of like the old D&D notion where there is no thief because everyone is a thief.
Yes. Actually, just a fun... So, Troy has been dying to bring Dungeon Crawl Classics into this conversation.
I'm just waiting for it to be relevant.
I am the last person to stand in his way. So I may as well swing this in. But DCC, very good game. Very much in the spirit of that old school mentality with its lethality, but also with enough modernisms to get rid of all those sort of clufty, weird rules that tend to make it harder to access. So it's got ascending armor class. It's effectively a D20 game. It has a few quirks on that, and it uses even weirder dice.
Yes.
Or more weird dice.
It goes all the way with the dice.
It's like, oh, your regular set of 20 to 4 is normal. Well, here's some more. Oddly enough, I have mixed feelings about that, but I get it. I'm willing to accept it. But the nice thing about it, I know that there are some diehard old school Essentials people out there. I think old school Essentials is probably one of the best restorations of an old game. But there's some things about that system where I'm like, eh. And I know people are going to say Thaco, and I'm like, no. I mean,
yes,
sort of, but not. Thaco is not the hill I'm going to die on. It's those damn saving throws.
Okay.
The weird bespoke saving throws like breath weapon and magic and like trap. And I'm like, why do we need 5 or 6 of these? It's weird.
Yeah, it is.
I will say though, one thing that points to though is this idea of a dungeon game, because all of those things are like, oh, I've got a saving throw against these specific things. And I feel like when you look at like say how the dwarf, which in BX, Basic Expert Dungeons and Dragons, is a class. So I'm sure this is news to no one of a certain stripe, but just to keep in mind, some games sort of set things like elf and dwarf and halfling
right
as a class. It does help make them more distinct by say dwarves having like certain trap awarenesses. That's sort of like a theme you see. It's even in like Hero Quest. Yeah, I don't know. DCC is nice because it takes that streamlinedness of 3rd edition, but it gets rid of all that noise of 3rd edition.
Well, one of the things that DCC did for me was it kind of like allowed me to play in the old school way with a more modern informed approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's what I'm driving at.
I think that to me is somewhat some of the best of DCC is that it is an old school game, but how OSE or Old School Essentials is old school in all of the ways, some regards even to a fault. It's like DCC makes some new choices. And like the Xochi dice, maybe that's not a great choice for a lot of people, because that kind of makes the game a little bit more obscure and harder to grok with.
Yeah, there's an accessibility issue that I have. There's also a bit of a math issue that I have, but that's fine. And it's funny because there's so I wanted to get into supplements to that point. So there is the support for DCC is fantastic in the sense that it's like fan support. So they have like little zine expansions, and people make these, and it's amazing. It somehow they've managed to cultivate and inspire that old school DIY style role playing experience. But one of them actually has what you were talking about, which is Everyone's a Thief. I think it's from the first issue of Crawl zine.
Okay.
I have it here. Yeah, and it's essentially like how to make it more like Conan.
Yeah.
Give everyone the thief skills.
100%. And having like these buff warrior dudes doing thief skill checks, I think that is so fun. And it really hits the dungeon survival aspect where everyone can search for a trap and everyone is kind of more aware of their environment and surroundings.
Yeah, I think they even include like backstab. Yep, so they got rules for humans only. That's very much the sword and sorcery approach.
Yeah, very sword and sorcery.
Yes, here we are. The rule: you are all thieves, and then it gives a breakdown about how different classes would use those skills.
That's so cool.
But yeah, there's so obviously at some point we'll actually go into doing a proper episode of that of Dungeon Crawl Classics and OSE and all these other things. Yeah, I think getting the spirit of that dungeon survival, dungeon crawl game, where this is the meat of the game. There's also wilderness survival, which was in fact an entirely different game. And that's fun too, but I haven't seen that done with the sense that this is the focus of the game.
Yeah.
Except perhaps Avalon Hill's Wilderness Survival itself.
The closest I can think of is Free League's The One Ring, where you're doing very Tolkien-esque trekking across the landscape. And that's very much a wilderness survival hex crawl experience, but it's very bespoke to the Tolkien theme.
That's very much in the spirit of Free League's output. Yeah,
I personally really dig the Free League stuff that's very tailored to each setting, like Aliens rocks, Blade Runner rocks, the Old World, no, not the Old World, the One Ring, that rocks. So all of these games are good examples of something being done like that. It's a bit of a tangent, but DCC or Dungeon Crawl Classics is kind of my favorite of the dungeon survival games. I really enjoy doing the funnel as well, where you start with the level 0 characters and you have a little stable of folks that you're trying to shepherd through a very lethal dungeon to see who makes it to the end and goes from level 0 to the, aspirational level 1.
I mean, I've run it, and when we were running it, how many players did we have?
Between 4 to 6.
I think we had somewhere in the range of 6 to start.
Yeah, we did.
Each of them with 3 characters. And while I don't necessarily recommend it with that many characters and players, we were using a VTT, so that helped a little.
Yeah.
You really get a feel for what that funnel is supposed to work, like how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Because people, especially when you first do it, the sense I was getting is that people are like, how heroic am I? Oh, not very. Like, how many hits? I mean, you can look at the math and you're like, I don't know, Jay, what was your
You're essentially
experience.
shoving all your characters into a blender and see who comes out intact. That's what it felt like.
Yeah, so more or less what it said on the tin, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Also, trying to keep all your playable characters in mind and where they can go can be a bit of a handful sometimes. So
Yep.
maybe the grinder helps out, like, get rid of these characters. Cool, so I got left.
Well,
I'll
and
play this guy.
maybe that brings another aspect, before we kind of finish up, but I don't know exactly how long we'll be going. But another aspect of dungeon survival, and I think this sometimes throws some people, but it goes along with the idea that it isn't that kind of like dramatic immersion game, is that there's a certain amount of meta implied in dungeon survival. I'm sure some people will push back on me on that one, but it's in the funnel, right?
Yeah.
You're playing 3 characters, you know they're going to die, and the meta is, okay, of these 3 guys, which one of them do I want to keep?
Yeah, it's a weird game of, like, trying to figure out who you want to get attached to and also not get attached to because the lethality is real.
Yeah. So, like, you may literally throw a body into a trap in order to set it off.
Yes, that's right. You do cynical things.
And also, your character with, like, the most garbage stats is the one who survives.
Well, that's always really interesting. But, like,
Yeah.
you're like, oh, yeah, this is the guy. And by the character's stats, they would likely have a slightly better chance of survival, but that doesn't guarantee anything. Most characters have between, this is absolutely no joke, 1 to 7 hit points.
And like 7 is a statistical anomaly.
7's top notch.
Yeah,
Yeah, those are good.
7 is pretty buff.
Yeah.
That's literally your top modifier on your stamina. And we may have had one character like that. Actually, if I remember correctly, the one character who had that decided to become a wizard. And I'm like, damn, that's a jacked wizard.
What do we say about buff wizards? We love them.
I know. There's like this precedent in one of my games for the absolutely buff wizard.
And our buddy played him as the jester, so...
Oh, yeah,
very
his
fun and
profession he
silly.
rolled was jester. And our friend, I gotta use this, Darren.
He commits.
He commits. He is one of the most selling players I have ever worked with. It's one of those guys where you don't want to be unfair and give him extra XP for the excellent commitment to the bit.
I get it, 100%.
But damn, it's hard not to do that. And yeah, and just for those that are into DCC, what was the module we were playing? It's that one that everybody loves.
I was going to say the ending of it, but I shouldn't.
Oh, don't say the ending. No spoilers on this channel. But yeah, it's fun, and that's the thing, is going back to the point of dungeon survival. It does that, like nobody's business, and it's weird too because we were mentioning this bespokeness of Free League games, but like the way the modules are written for DCC imply a certain. I don't want to say that they feel like the module experience feels like it's a bit on rails, but it does. It isn't, but it feels that way. And it's only through trying out what this thing is like in a sandbox do you realize that it also works like that. But it's not advertised as such. It very much seems to be like, oh, you play one module and then you connect it to the next. It's just about stringing these modules together.
Right.
And that's just implicitly the way that it seems. But like listening to like other reviewers and people in the hobby talk about it, and having tried to do more of a sandbox style game, it does work in the way that the like old school dungeon crawler would work, which is you are guaranteed nothing but your attempt.
Yes.
And that's the nice thing about having it that way, is that there is now decades of sage-like advice about how to do that.
Yeah, 100%.
The main trick is have followers so that you could be them if you die.
Yeah, 100%. Preload some NPCs.
Yeah, that way it's not a workaround. And in fact, the way that I was handling our game was essentially treating them like subordinate secondary characters that could also level up, but effectively only the character you were playing at the time could be the one in charge. So
Yeah.
they couldn't be a higher level than you. Or Jay, Final Fantasy Tactics, I think if you get Brave and Faith up to a certain amount, they bug out on you.
Yeah, they'll leave.
I was somewhat inspired by that idea, which is not that they'll leave, but they just won't cooperate with one player running two guys at the same level.
I think if you get Brave up to like 80 or 90,
Yeah.
I think past 90, like they'll just be like, "Oh, I'm out, peace."
Yeah, I think
So you can't get your characters too high
Faith
level.
works the same
or
way,
stat
but
level.
it's
Yeah, I think
different ending.
they similar idea, but they leave your party. So
Yeah.
if they get too good, they get too overconfident, they go.
So I took some inspiration from that. That I basically said, like, if you're playing two of your own characters in the party, then you're playing the one with the higher level.
Yeah. I think one thing I noticed with that game, it's a very fun game if everyone's on point with it.
Yeah.
Character progression feels super slow if you're not playing continual games.
Yeah.
Consistently, like within close time with each other, because just like leveling up is such a slow process because how exponentially more experience you need for each level.
Yeah. Also,
And if characters are dying, it's like, well, back to square one, go to 0, do the funnel again. So you need to have lots of characters to go through and lots of sessions to play. Otherwise, the game just feels real slow.
The way that it's dished out is quite particular because you're only getting 4 to 5 on a good encounter. There's a nice thing about a lot of them saying like, hey, if you jump out or run away, you still get some experience. So experience in that game is based around threat level. But I think I've heard people porting over the gold for XP thing and it working out pretty well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was like a nice little boost to get you going.
Yeah, so every gold piece taken out of the dungeon is 1 XP.
I think that'd be a thing I'd be really into when we get back into playing that.
Yep.
Would be to kind of modify and make the progression feel just a little bit quicker. Just to kind of feel like we get more level character progression. Still keep the deadliness because that's always fun in those style games. Just keep it so feel like you're progressing where you're getting more.
Do you
100%.
think more narrative style leveling systems like level up per 1 to 2 session would work in a dungeon survival game?
I suppose
because
like I'm not
it's
sure.
not as granular as getting XP from specific encounters or treasure halls or something, but it could solve the problem Jay's describing here.
Yeah, it's like an incentive thing. I think that for me, the gold for XP thing, the one sweet spot that it hits is it really incentivizes you to find treasure.
I think the level up per session, just like you do a little session play, you level up then and get your crates then, or it's guaranteed, is maybe beneficial for like if you're playing more games not as like often in a month.
Or a narrative.
More narrative focused game. I think it really depends on the style of game you and your players want to play. But I think that could work really well. It depends what you guys want to play.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the players are going to do something of interest, even if it is that sort of milestone leveling. But I'm just worried about... I'm someone that appreciates incentive structures. And so there's some concern about people dicking around.
Right.
Where like, oh, well, we're just going to level up by the end of the session. Why not probe this room endlessly for its obnoxious details?
Yeah, there's definitely a meta you can expose there and futz around with. But I think the idea would be everyone is going to hopefully be playing and hopefully keep the game flowing. But I again, as your GM, I think then you make the call of, hey, none of that business. You know, that's your... If you're running the game, then you can hopefully, haul that in a bit.
Oh, yeah. Just to jump back to the funnel, it's Sailors on the Starless Sea.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
At least of all the ones I read, it was the one that I wanted to run. And actually, as an interesting point, it's very, and other people have pointed this out, it feels Warhammery.
It does.
Like in the best possible way. That's part of the reason I picked it, because my house setting shares a lot in common with Warhammer, and I'm like, well, that's perfect.
That is very perfect.
So anyway, I guess that'll do it for this. We went all over the place, but I guess that's the point.
That is the point of the B-side. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Max and Jay, for your time. And I hope everyone has a great, rest of the day.
Yeah, I mean, this will come out after the holiday at some point, so we are recording this just before Christmas.
Exactly. That's kind of where I was going. I was going to recommend a great holiday, but it'll be on. It'll be long
this isn't
gone.
Live. What's going on? No. Yeah. So anyway, Thank you for listening. If you put up with this until the end, hope you will hear us again soon.
Until next time.